A millionaire invited a homeless girl to dinner on Christmas Eve. The next day, he wanted her to be his wife because the streets of Chicago glowed under the faint shimmer of Christmas lights, their reflections winking off the icy pavement. Snow fell in slow, deliberate swirls, softening the sharp edges of a city that rarely stopped moving. Edward Cole jammed his hands deeper into the pockets of his wool coat, the collar pulled high against the biting wind. Around him, families laughed, couples huddled close, and children pressed their noses against frosted storefront windows. He barely noticed. His gaze lingered on the glow of a distant street lamp as his mother's words played on repeat in his mind. "You'll do what's best for the family, Edward. The Whitmore alliance is non-negotiable." Her voice was ice, her logic colder. Marry Olivia Whitmore, daughter of his father's most powerful business partner, or lose the foundation his family had built for him. His jaw tightened. Turning a corner, he almost missed the figure huddled by a stack of crates near the alley behind an upscale bistro. She was crouched low, her hands trembling as she rifled through a trash bin. The golden light spilling from the restaurant's windows framed her, a stark contrast between abundance and desperation. He stopped mid-stride, his breath visible in the cold. "Hey!" he called out, unsure if his voice carried over the clinking of dishes and muffled laughter from the restaurant. The figure froze. Slowly, she turned her head, revealing a pale face framed by messy brown hair escaping from a knit cap. Her eyes, a piercing green, narrowed as she straightened slightly. "Not looking for trouble," she said quickly, her voice steady but defensive. Edward approached cautiously, aware of how his tailored coat and polished shoes might look against her worn jacket and scuffed boots. "Neither am I," he replied. Are you hungry?" Her eyes darted to the restaurant behind him, then back. "What do you think?" she said, a faint edge in her tone. He glanced at the bin, where a half-eaten baguette balanced precariously on top of a crumpled napkin. "Come inside," he offered, nodding toward the bistro. "Have a proper meal." She hesitated, her expression unreadable. "What's the catch?" "No catch." He pulled open the door, the warm air carrying the scent of roasted garlic and fresh bread spilling out. "It's Christmas." Her brows furrowed, suspicion flickering across her face, but hunger won. She grabbed a frayed backpack and stepped past him, shoulders squared as if daring someone to question her. Inside, the maitre d's polite smile faltered as his gaze landed on her, but Edward's presence silenced any objection. They were seated at a small table near the window, the din of clinking glasses and murmured conversation enveloping them. The woman's fingers fidgeted with the edge of the linen napkin, her gaze flitting across the menu like she was reading a foreign language. Edward leaned back, studying her. She wasn't much older than him, though her face bore a kind of weariness that couldn't be measured in years. "Order whatever you want," he said. She set the menu down and folded her arms. "Don't patronize me. I'll get soup." "That's fine." A flicker of a smile crossed his lips. "You sure? You could do better than soup." Her eyes met his, sharp and unyielding. "You could have left me in the alley." "Fair point." He raised his hands in mock surrender. The waiter returned, and she ordered with curt efficiency, barely glancing at him. As the waiter left, Edward leaned forward slightly. "What's your name?" "Joyce." "I'm Edward." She nodded, silent for a beat. Then, "Why'd you do it?" "Do what?" "Bring me in here." She gestured vaguely to the lavish surroundings, her tone tight with skepticism. "Guys like you don't usually notice people like me." He considered this. "Maybe I wanted to prove my family wrong." Her brow furrowed. "Prove them wrong about what?" "That I don't have to do what they expect. That I can make my own choices." Joyce tilted her head, the faintest trace of a smirk pulling at her lips. So, I'm your rebellion? Maybe, he admitted with a shrug. But honestly, I saw you and thought you shouldn't have to eat out of a trash bin on Christmas Eve. Her smirk faded. For a moment, the walls in her eyes wavered. Well, thanks, she said softly. When their meals arrived, she ate methodically, evidently savoring each bite while closely monitoring him. Between spoonfuls of soup, fragments of her story emerged. How her father's fall from grace had left her with nothing but a guitar and the clothes on her back. Edward didn't press for details, sensing she wasn't ready to share more. In return, he revealed his frustration with the suffocating expectations of his family, the arranged marriage looming like a prison sentence. Must be tough, she said, her voice tinged with sarcasm. Trapped in your penthouse with nowhere to go but up. Her comment stung, but he smiled faintly. Yeah, I guess it sounds ridiculous, but money doesn't solve everything. No, she agreed, her gaze distant. It doesn't. They sat in silence for a moment, the bistro's golden light casting soft shadows between them. For Edward, it felt like the first real conversation he'd had in years. For Joyce, it was a fleeting reprieve from the harshness of the world outside. And as the snow continued to fall beyond the window, neither of them realized just how much their lives had begun to shift. The clink of silverware on china grew faint as the bistro emptied, the warm hum of conversation dwindling to a murmur. Joyce pushed her empty soup bowl aside, her fingers brushing the edge of the napkin, in a way that felt more contemplative than casual. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. She didn't meet Edward's eyes, her focus lingering on the condensation collecting on her glass. "For the meal, and for, you know." She gestured vaguely, as if the words she needed couldn't quite form. Edward leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You don't have to leave so soon," he said, the offer hanging in the air like an unspoken question. Joyce shook her head. "I've been here too long already." She stood, her movements quick and deliberate, slinging her frayed backpack over one shoulder. For a fleeting moment, she hesitated at the door, as though she might turn back, but then she pushed it open, letting the cold night rush in. Edward stayed seated, his gaze fixed on the empty chair across from him. Outside, the snow swirled beneath the streetlights. His fingers drummed absently on the table as his thoughts turned inward, replaying his mother's clipped commands and his father's unyielding gaze. For all his privilege, he realized he envied her freedom to simply walk away. The morning broke cold and grey, Chicago's skyline disappearing into the low-hanging clouds. Edward sat in his penthouse, the untouched remnants of a black coffee cooling on the marble counter. He stared out at the frost-laden windows, replaying the brief moments with Joyce from the night before. Her guarded expression, the subtle tremble in her hands as she lifted the soup spoon, those details lingered, refusing to fade. By noon, the nagging feeling persisted. He grabbed his coat, ignored the buzzing of his phone, likely another message from Olivia or his mother, and headed for the alley behind the bistro. When he turned the corner, he saw her. Joyce sat cross-legged on the icy pavement, her back leaning against a graffiti-marked wall. The frayed edge of her jacket collar brushed her chin as she scribbled into a small, dog-eared notebook, the tip of her pencil faintly tapping against the page. "Joyce," he called, hesitating when her head snapped up. Her eyes, sharp and wary, locked onto him. She clutched the notebook to her chest as if it contained some great secret. "What are you doing here?" He approached slowly, his breath misting in the cold air. "I was hoping to find you." "Congratulations," she said, her tone clipped. "You found me. Now what?" Edward crouched to her level, the concrete biting through his tailored trousers. I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation last night. Her lips quirked into something that wasn't quite a smile. You rich guys don't usually lose sleep over people like me. Maybe not, he admitted, but you're not like anyone I've met. Her eyes narrowed. Flattery's not going to get you anywhere. He let out a breath, his shoulders rising and falling with the weight of what he was about to say. I need your help. Joyce barked a laugh, the sound hollow. My help? That's new. I'm serious. His voice softened, almost pleading. I'm in a situation, an impossible one, really. My parents are forcing me into a marriage I don't want. It's not about love. It's about business, family alliances. And I won't do it. So why tell me? She asked, folding her arms across her chest. Because you might be the only one who can help me stop it, he replied. If I'm already married, their plan falls apart. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant hum of passing cars. Joyce stared at him as if he'd spoken a foreign language. You want me to marry you? She asked, incredulous. Temporarily, Edward clarified. Just for a year. It's a business arrangement, nothing more. Joyce's laugh was sharper this time, cutting through the icy air. A business arrangement? With someone you found digging through a trash bin? You sure you don't need your head checked? He didn't flinch. You'd have a place to live, food, clothes, whatever you need to get back on your feet. And I'd make sure you're set financially when it's over. Her gaze hardened. Why me? There are a million women out there who'd line up for this deal. Why pick the homeless girl? Edward paused, his jaw tightening. Because you're not like them. You don't care about money or status. You're honest, real, and you'd have as much to gain from this as I would. Her grip on the notebook tightened, her knuckles turning white. And what if I say no? Then I'll find someone else, he said, his tone honest but laced with desperation. But I'd rather it be you. Joyce stood, her boots scraping against the concrete. Do you honestly believe that a fictitious marriage will resolve all your issues? I'll deal with them, he said firmly. But first, I need to take back control of my life. She turned away, her shoulders hunched against the cold. For a long moment, she said nothing, staring at the brick wall in front of her. Edward stood as well, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. Joyce, I know it's insane, and I won't blame you if you walk away. But if you say yes, it could change both our lives. She tilted her head slightly, her voice quieter now. You think a deal's going to fix me? My life's not something you can just patch up with money and promises. I don't think you need fixing, Edward said. I just think you deserve a chance. Her shoulders sagged, the fight in her fading. Slowly she turned to face him, her expression unreadable. You'll draw up a contract? Anything you want, he promised. With her thoughts swirling behind her green eyes, she chewed her bottom lip. Finally, she extended her hand. 1 year, she said. No more, no less, and I keep my independence. Edward grasped her hand, his grip firm but warm. 1 year. As they shook, Joyce looked at him, her voice tinged with both defiance and resignation. If you screw me over, I'm gone. No second chances. I wouldn't expect anything less, Edward replied, a flicker of relief crossing his face. The deal was struck, though neither of them fully understood just how much it would change them both. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing Edward's penthouse in all its modern splendor. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the sprawling Chicago skyline, the city's lights casting a faint, golden glow over the polished hardwood floors and sleek furniture. Joyce stepped inside, her boots scuffing slightly against the pristine floor as she took in her surroundings. Her gaze drifted across the space, marble countertops in the open kitchen, a grand piano tucked into a corner, and an abstract painting that screamed of wealth she couldn't begin to fathom. She stood there, still as stone, her backpack slung over one shoulder, feeling impossibly small. "Impressive, right?" Edward's voice broke the silence. Joyce glanced over her shoulder at him. "It's clean," she said, her tone flat. He smirked, crossing the room to set his keys on the counter. "Clean? That's the best you've got?" She shrugged, shifting awkwardly. "I don't have a lot to compare it to." Her eyes lingered on the view outside, the sprawling city stretching endlessly into the night. "You'll get used to it," Edward said, walking past her. "Make yourself comfortable." Her brow furrowed as she took a tentative step forward. "Home," she muttered under her breath, as though the word didn't quite fit. Edward disappeared into another room, leaving her alone to take it all in. The silence was oppressive. She walked to the kitchen, trailing her fingers along the edge of the island counter, her reflection distorted in the glossy surface. "All right," Edward called, returning with a folder in hand. "Here's the contract. Go through it whenever you want. We can adjust anything if you're not comfortable." Joyce took the folder, but didn't open it. "You really think this is going to work?" "I don't see why not," he said, leaning against the counter. "We both get what we need. It's just a matter of sticking to the plan." "Plans," she murmured, setting the folder down. "Those always go so well." Edward tilted his head, studying her. "You don't strike me as someone who gives up easily." "I don't," she said, meeting his gaze. "But I also don't like being told what to do. Therefore, refrain from assuming control simply because this is your domain." A laugh escaped him, low and genuine. "Noted. What about dinner? I can have something brought in." "I'll cook," she said abruptly. Edward raised an eyebrow. "Cook?" "Yes. It's not like I've had anyone waiting on me before. Don't see why I should start now." "All right," he said, holding his hands up in surrender. "Kitchen's yours." Later that evening, Joyce stood over a steaming pot on the stove, stirring with a focus that seemed almost too intense. Edward sat at the counter, his chin propped on his hand as he watched her. "You look like you're defusing a bomb," he teased. "I'm trying not to burn it," she shot back without looking up. "What is it anyway?" "Soup." He laughed softly. "You really like soup, huh?" "It's cheap and filling," she said, finally glancing at him. "Why? Too humble for your royal palate?" He grinned. "Not at all. I'm just impressed you're doing this instead of, I don't know, ordering takeout." "I don't trust things that show up in boxes," she said dryly, ladling the soup into 2 bowls. As they ate in the quiet warmth of the penthouse, Edward found himself glancing at her more often than the food. She ate methodically, her eyes flicking toward the window every so often, as though the city lights might disappear if she looked away too long. "You're not what I expected," he said suddenly. She looked up, a spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "What did you expect?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Someone more—" He trailed off, searching for the word. "Grateful?" she offered, her tone sharp. "No," he said quickly. "Just, I don't know. Different." Joyce smirked. "Well, sorry to disappoint. I am who I am." "And who is that?" Her smirk faded slightly, replaced by something more guarded. "Someone who doesn't like answering questions," she said, returning her attention to the bowl. Edward leaned back in his chair, letting the silence settle. He didn't push. That night, as Joyce settled into the guest room, she sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers brushing the crisp, white sheets. The room was immaculate, too perfect, too untouched. She stared at the suitcase Edward had insisted on buying her earlier, filled with clothes that still had tags on them. Across the hall, Edward sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand. His father's voice echoed in his mind, sharp and commanding, as it had so many times before. A coal doesn't bend, a coal doesn't break. Remember that. He stared out the window, the city below stretching into the darkness. For a brief moment, he wondered if this arrangement would solve anything, or if he was just adding another layer to the chaos. In their separate corners of the penthouse, Edward and Joyce both grappled with the same unspoken thought. What the hell have I gotten myself into? Edward sipped his coffee, his gaze lingering on Joyce as she sat across the counter, flipping through a magazine she had found on the kitchen table. The room was unusually quiet, save for the faint hum of the city outside the penthouse windows. Clearing his throat, he broke the silence. "Hey, I forgot to mention," he began, setting his cup down. "There's a charity gala this weekend. I need you to come with me." Joyce glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Why? You need someone to hold your champagne glass?" He smirked, leaning forward. "Not quite. We're supposed to look like a married couple, remember? This is part of the deal." She sighed, closing the magazine with a deliberate slap. "Fine, but if anyone asks me which fork to use, I'm leaving." The night of the gala arrived, and Joyce stood in front of the full-length mirror in the guest room, pulling at the hem of the sleek black dress Edward had insisted she wear. It was elegant, but understated. Paired with simple jewelry and heels, she was still figuring out how to walk in. When Edward knocked and stepped into the room, he froze momentarily, his gaze sweeping over her. "You look good," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. "Don't sound so shocked," she quipped, grabbing the small clutch he had handed her earlier. "Let's get this over with." The ballroom was dazzling, with crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the polished marble floors. Waiters glided between guests, offering trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Edward guided Joyce through the crowd with an ease that made her feel like a spectator at a play she didn't audition for. "You don't have to do much," he whispered, leaning close to her ear. "Smile, nod, and let me handle the conversations." "Got it," she muttered, plastering on a polite smile as they approached a small cluster of impeccably dressed guests. Joyce found herself fielding curious glances and thinly veiled questions about her background, but to her surprise, she navigated the interactions with a sharp wit that seemed to catch people off guard. One guest leaned toward Edward, remarking, "Your wife is quite the charmer." Edward smiled faintly, glancing at her. "She is," he replied, his tone genuine. From across the room, Olivia's eyes followed Joyce with growing suspicion. The way Joyce held herself, the sharpness of her tongue, it didn't fit the image of a society wife. Something felt off, and Olivia intended to find out what it was. The evening took a darker turn when Victoria approached Joyce near the bar. The older woman's smile was polite but cold, her words cutting beneath the surface. "So tell me," Victoria began, her tone dripping with feigned interest, "where exactly did you and Edward meet? It's such a whirlwind, this marriage of yours." Joyce's smile didn't falter. "Fate has a funny way of bringing people together," she said lightly, swirling the champagne in her glass. "Indeed," Victoria replied, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Though I do wonder if fate has ever been so unconventional." She sipped her drink, her meaning clear. Edward appeared at Joyce's side, his hand resting lightly on her back. "Mother," he said, his tone firm, "I see you've met Joyce. I hope you're being hospitable." Victoria's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, darling. We were just getting to know each other." With that, she excused herself, leaving behind an air of tension. "You okay?" Edward asked, leaning closer. "I'm fine," Joyce replied, though her grip on the glass suggested otherwise. "Your mother is quite difficult to manage." "Welcome to the family," he muttered, a hint of regret in his voice. By the time they returned to the penthouse, the night's tension still lingered. Joyce kicked off her heels and collapsed onto the couch, rubbing the back of her neck. Edward loosened his tie, pouring himself a glass of whiskey before sitting across from her. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said after a moment. She snorted. "Your mum would strongly disagree." "Forget her," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "What you did tonight? You were incredible. You made me look good out there." Joyce leaned back, her expression softening. "Not bad for a girl who doesn't belong in your world, huh?" "You belong wherever you decide to be," Edward replied, surprising even himself with the sincerity in his voice. They sat in silence for a moment, the city lights casting faint shadows on their faces. For the first time since their arrangement began, the space between them felt less like an impassable gap and more like common ground. As Joyce reached for the blanket draped over the couch, she caught Edward watching her. "What?" she asked, her tone defensive. "Nothing," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Just, thanks for tonight." She shrugged, pulling the blanket over herself. "Don't get used to it." Edward laughed softly, raising his glass. Noted. In that quiet moment, trust began to take root. Fragile, but undeniable. Olivia Whitmore sat in her penthouse, a glass of wine in hand, the faint glow of the city lights illuminating her features. She gently tapped her well-groomed nails against the sleek armrest of her chair, her thoughts swirling like vultures. Joyce, the mysterious woman who had managed to upend everything. Edward's sudden marriage had thrown Olivia's carefully laid plans into chaos, and she couldn't let it go. Who was she? Olivia mused, her mind lingering on Joyce's sharp wit and poised demeanor at the gala. Her smile had disarmed the guests, but it had only deepened Olivia's unease. There was something about her that didn't quite fit. By morning, Olivia had set her plan into motion. She placed a call to a private investigator, a man known for his discretion and efficiency. "I want everything on her," she said curtly. Her family, her past, her connections. Investigate every aspect thoroughly. It took less than 48 hours for the report to land on her desk. As Olivia flipped through the pages, her lips curved into a triumphant smirk. Vincent Wagner, the name leapt out at her like a beacon. The disgraced mogul, the architect of one of the most notorious financial scandals in recent history. And there was Joyce, a younger version of the woman she had met, standing in a photograph beside him. Olivia leaned back, the satisfaction almost palpable. "So that's your secret," she murmured, her voice dripping with vindication. "Edward, you've married the daughter of a criminal." She picked up her phone, her tone gleeful as she dialed. "Victoria, you're going to want to hear this." Victoria Cole set down her teacup, her lips pursed as Olivia's words poured through the receiver. The older woman's eyes narrowed, the disdain in her expression deepening with every detail. "She's Vincent Wagner's daughter." Victoria's voice dropped into a low, incredulous murmur. "Undeniable," Olivia replied with clipped satisfaction. "The resemblance, the records. She's the same Joyce Wagner. It's all there." Victoria's grip on the phone tightened. "Thank you, Olivia. I'll take care of it." Hanging up, Victoria leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The revelation was a gift, a perfect weapon to dismantle this ridiculous charade Edward had orchestrated. A Cole couldn't afford to be tainted by the Wagner name, not after everything. The confrontation came the next evening. Joyce had just returned to the penthouse after a walk through the city, her cheeks pink from the cold. She found Victoria waiting in the living room, her posture stiff, her expression razor sharp. Joyce hesitated at the doorway. "Victoria," she said cautiously, "I didn't know you'd be here." Victoria rose slowly, smoothing the fabric of her coat with deliberate care. "I thought it was time we had a conversation," she said, her tone brittle. Joyce stepped further into the room, her hand instinctively clutching the strap of her bag. "About what?" Victoria's gaze pinned her in place. "About who you really are." The words fell silently, akin to a stone. "I don't know what you're talking about," Joyce said, though her voice wavered. "Oh, don't play coy," Victoria snapped. "Vincent Wagner. Does that sound familiar to you? Or should I say, Father?" Joyce froze, her breath catching. For a moment, the carefully constructed walls she had built around herself threatened to crumble. "You've been lying," Victoria continued, her voice cold and cutting. "Pretending to be someone else, attaching yourself to my son for... what? Money? Influence? Redemption for your family's disgrace?" "That's not true," Joyce said sharply, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "Oh, spare me," Victoria spat. "Do you think for a second I would let someone like you sully the Cole name? You don't belong here, and you never will." Joyce's hands curled into fists at her sides. "I never asked to be here, Victoria. I didn't seek this out. And as for my father..." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet Victoria's icy stare. "I've spent my whole life running from his shadow. I'm not him." "Then why hide it?" Victoria shot back. "If you were so innocent, why didn't you tell Edward the truth?" The question hung in the air, a knife twisting in an already open wound. Edward walked in just as Victoria's voice rose, his gaze flicking between the two women. "What's going on?" he demanded, his tone sharp. Victoria turned to him, her expression triumphant. "Ask your wife who she really is." Joyce opened her mouth to speak, but Edward's eyes were already on her, his expression a mixture of confusion and hurt. "Joyce," she hesitated, her throat tightening. "Edward, Edward took the papers from his mother. His eyes narrowed. A feeling of suffocation washed over him. There was no one in the business world who did not know the name Vincent Wagner. His father had always used it as a lesson in the failure of an empire to keep him focused and strong. "Is it true?" he interrupted, his voice low. "Are you Wagner's daughter?" Joyce nodded, the weight of the truth crushing her. "Yes, but it's not what you think. You lied to me," Edward cut in, his tone hard. "I didn't lie," she said quickly. "I just didn't tell you. I didn't think it mattered. I've spent years trying to leave that part of my life behind." "You didn't think it mattered?" Edward repeated, incredulous. "Do you know what people will say when they find out? What this could do to everything I've worked for?" Her heart clenched at the accusation. "I'm not my father," she said, her voice breaking. "I've spent my whole life trying to prove that, to survive, and now you're judging me for something I had no control over." "I don't know what to believe," Edward admitted, his voice quieter now but no less strained. "You should have told me." Tears stung Joyce's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I thought you'd understand," she said, her voice trembling. "You, of all people, should know what it's like to live under someone else's expectations. But I guess I was wrong." Edward looked away, his jaw tight. The silence that followed was suffocating. "I can't stay here," Joyce said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not like this." "Joyce," Edward began, but she shook her head, grabbing her bag. "No," she said firmly. "I won't be someone you look at with doubt and distrust. I deserve better than that." Without another word, she walked out, the door clicking shut behind her. Edward stood there, staring at the empty space she left behind, the weight of his actions sinking in. For the first time, he wondered if he'd just lost something, or someone. He couldn't afford to let go. The penthouse was unbearably silent. Edward paced the living room, the echo of Joyce's parting words bouncing relentlessly in his mind. "I won't be someone you look at with doubt and distrust." He stared out the massive windows, the Chicago skyline stretching endlessly before him. The city was alive with lights and movement, but here, within these walls, everything felt dead. He sipped his whiskey, though the burn offered little comfort. Edward's gaze fell on the spot where Joyce had often sat, reading or quietly sketching in that dog-eared notebook she carried everywhere. He clenched his jaw, her absence cutting sharper than he expected. His mother's smug words from earlier replayed in his mind, and with them, the dawning realization of how deeply he had let her manipulate him. Had Joyce really lied to him, or had he simply refused to see beyond her past? He picked up his phone, scrolling aimlessly through old messages. His thumb hovered over Joyce's name. He wanted to call her, to say something, anything. But what could he possibly say that would undo the damage? Joyce's fingers drifted over the piano keys in the dimly lit lounge of a small downtown cafe. The instrument was worn, its ivory cracked and yellowed, but it sang when she played. A soft, melancholy tune spilled from her fingertips, weaving through the air like a confession. A small audience lingered, a mix of regulars and newcomers captivated by the way her music seemed to speak directly to their hearts. Joyce kept her gaze low, her connection to the keys unbroken. As the final note hung in the air, the crowd clapped quietly, and she gave a polite nod, retreating into the shadows near the bar. The applause didn't matter. She wasn't playing for them. She was playing for herself, for the girl who had learned to love music in a sprawling mansion's echoing halls, and for the woman who had lost it all when that life shattered. "Joyce, that was beautiful," the cafe owner said, handing her a cup of tea. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice soft. The cafe owner hesitated. "You okay? You've been quieter than usual." Joyce offered a faint smile. "I'm fine. Just thinking." The truth was, she couldn't stop thinking about Edward. Despite everything, he lingered in her mind, as persistent as a melody she couldn't shake. Edward couldn't take it any more. He threw on a jacket and headed to his office. The vast space felt cold and clinical, yet it was where he could think, or so he hoped. He flipped through reports, staring blankly at pages of numbers and graphs, until a knock at the door startled him. Brenda stepped in, her expression hesitant. "Everything okay? Does it look okay?" He snapped, before sighing heavily. "Sorry. I didn't mean that." Brenda sat across from him, setting her tablet aside. "It's about Joyce, isn't it?" Edward didn't respond, but the silence was answer enough. "Edward, if you're going to let your mother's opinion dictate every decision, you're going to lose a lot more than Joyce," she said firmly. He looked up at her, startled by her candor. "Don't give me that look," Brenda continued. "You know she manipulated this whole situation. And Olivia, she's practically celebrating." Edward leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I don't even know where to start." "You start by asking yourself, what matters more? Your reputation or the person who actually made you happy for once?" Her words struck him deeply. He had been so focused on the fallout, the potential damage to his name, that he hadn't stopped to consider what he had sacrificed in the process. Joyce's music became her sanctuary. She played in small venues, her confidence growing with every performance. Each note felt like a step forward, a reclaiming of the life she had nearly lost. But even as she played, there were moments, quiet pauses between sets, where she'd catch herself thinking about Edward, his quiet humor, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She hated herself for missing him, but the ache was undeniable. One night, after closing out a show, Joyce sat at the piano long after the crowd had gone. She played softly, her thoughts drifting. "Beautiful as always." The voice startled her, and she turned to see an older man leaning against the bar. He had been at several of her performances, always listening intently. "Thanks," she said, offering a small smile. "You've got a rare gift," he said. "It's not just skill, it's heart." She nodded, not trusting herself to respond. Back at the penthouse, Edward paced the length of the living room. His mother's words, Olivia's scheming, Brenda's voice, even his own anger, they all blurred together, a cacophony of noise that refused to quiet. He contacted local musicians, gathered a small audience, and made sure every detail reflected the person she was, not the person his family had tried to paint her as. The plan was simple: a night of music, an open invitation for Joyce to return to the stage. As the preparations came together, Edward felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. For once he wasn't acting for his family, for appearances, or for some calculated gain. This was for her. And as he stood in the empty theatre, staring at the spotlight on the stage, he made a silent vow. He wouldn't lose her again, not without a fight. He contacted local musicians, gathered a small audience, and made sure every detail reflected the person she was, not the person his family had tried to paint her as. The plan was simple: a night of music, an open invitation for Joyce to return to the stage. As the preparations came together, Edward felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. For once, he wasn't acting for his family, for appearances, or for some calculated gain. This was for her. And as he stood in the empty theatre, staring at the spotlight on the stage, he made a silent vow. He wouldn't lose her again. Not without a fight. The January air was crisp, swirling with faint traces of snow as a crowd gathered in the heart of Chicago's City Park. Strings of twinkling lights lined the walkways, casting a warm glow against the frosty landscape. A grand piano stood on a modest stage, its glossy surface reflecting the lights strung above. Edward stood at the edge of the park, his breath visible in the cold air as he watched people slowly fill the space. Homeless individuals clutching donated blankets, families huddled together, curious passers-by drawn by the music already beginning to play. This wasn't just a concert. It was an act of redemption. Edward's hands tightened in his pockets as he thought back to Joyce's quiet confessions about music, the way she had described it as her escape, her lifeline. He remembered the spark in her eyes when she played, her fingers dancing across the keys as if she were telling a story only she understood. Tonight, he wanted to give that back to her. The park's makeshift stage was framed by strings of fairy lights, but it wasn't extravagant. It didn't need to be. This wasn't a grand event for high society. It was something real, raw, and deeply personal. Exactly like her. Joyce stood at the edge of the park, her fingers curling tightly around the strap of her bag. She hadn't planned to come, had told herself repeatedly that she wouldn't, but curiosity had won. The flyer she'd found at the cafe, bearing her name in bold letters, was tucked into her coat pocket. Edward had done this. There was no doubt in her mind. She watched from the shadows as a small group of musicians took the stage, their instruments weaving together a melody that echoed through the cold air. The crowd clapped and cheered, but Joyce stood frozen. Her gaze drifted to the piano at the center of the stage, and her chest tightened. It wasn't just any piano, it was the one at Edward's house. The old, slightly scratched one from the penthouse, the one she had spent hours practicing on when she thought Edward wasn't paying attention. He had brought it here. Joyce. She turned abruptly to find Brenda standing behind her, bundled in a long coat and scarf. "You should go up there," Brenda said gently. Joyce shook her head. "I can't." "You can," Brenda insisted. "And you should. This is for you." Joyce hesitated, her heart pounding. She looked back at the stage, at the crowd, and finally at the piano. "Do you really think this will change anything?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Brenda's gaze softened. "Maybe. But it's not just about Edward. It's about you. You've been hiding for so long, Joyce. Maybe it's time to stop." Edward's pulse quickened as he spotted her approaching the stage, her figure barely visible against the sea of bundled-up spectators. She climbed the steps slowly, her hand brushing the piano's surface as if grounding herself. The crowd quieted, murmurs fading as they turned their attention to her. Joyce was seated on the piano bench, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the keys. She glanced at Edward, standing at the edge of the stage, his expression equal parts hopeful and apologetic. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the first key. The sound resonated through the park, soft and haunting, a melody that seemed to draw the cold air closer. Joyce's hands moved fluidly, each note building on the next, creating a piece that was equal parts sorrow and strength. She closed her eyes, letting the music guide her, pouring every unspoken word, every ounce of pain and hope into the performance. When the final note faded, the silence was deafening. And then the applause came, thunderous, genuine, overwhelming. Joyce blinked, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. People stood, clapping and cheering, their faces filled with admiration. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as Vincent Wagner's daughter, but as herself. Edward waited until the crowd began to disperse before approaching her. She was still seated at the piano, her fingers lightly grazing the keys as if reluctant to let go. "You were incredible," he said softly. Joyce looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Why did you do this?" "Because I needed you to know how much you matter," Edward said, his voice steady. "Not to my family, not to anyone else, to me." Her throat tightened, and she looked away. "Edward, I'm not asking for forgiveness," he interrupted. "I know I hurt you, and I can't undo that. But I can give you something better." He pulled a small envelope from his coat pocket and placed it on the piano. Joyce frowned, picking it up and unfolding the paper inside. Her breath caught as she read the letter. The words, "Paris Conservatory of Music," standing out sharply against the page. "I made some calls," Edward explained. "They're expecting you next semester. Full scholarship, everything covered. You'll get to do what you love, the way you deserve to." Joyce stared at the letter, her emotions warring within her. "Why would you do this?" "Because you deserve to." Joyce stared at the letter, her emotions warring within her. "Why would you do this?" "Because you deserve it," he said simply. "And because I want you to be happy, even if it's far away from here." Tears filled her eyes, and for a moment, she didn't trust herself to speak. "Thank you," she whispered finally, her voice breaking. Edward nodded, stepping back. "It's your stage now, Joyce. Don't let anyone take it away from you again." As he walked away, the faint sound of applause echoed in his mind. Her applause, her victory, her future. The airport buzzed with muted chaos. Announcements crackled over the intercom, carts rattled across polished floors, and travelers rushed past in hurried waves. Joyce stood near the terminal window, her fingers brushing the edges of her boarding pass. Beyond the glass, planes idled on the runway, their lights blinking faintly against the grey Chicago-bound skies. Her piano piece from the park concert still echoed in her mind, the applause lingering like a bittersweet refrain. But now, standing here, about to leave for Paris, the weight of her decision pressed down harder than ever. She glanced at her ticket, and then at the departure board, her stomach knotting. This was what she wanted, wasn't it? A fresh start, a chance to chase her dream without the shadows of her past looming over her. Second-guessing already. The familiar voice startled her. Joyce turned to see Brenda approaching, bundled in a thick coat and scarf, a brown envelope tucked under her arm. "What are you doing here?" Joyce asked, her voice soft but touched with warmth. "Delivery," Brenda replied with a wry smile, holding out the envelope. "From Edward." Joyce's chest tightened. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing the edges of the thick paper. Brenda tilted her head. "Read it. He wanted you to have it before you left." Joyce nodded, stepping away from the crowd to a quiet corner. She slid the letter out, the familiar steady handwriting catching her attention immediately. "Dear Joyce, I know this letter can't undo the hurt I've caused. I won't pretend it will. But I need to say this, truthfully and without interruption. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for doubting you when you trusted me enough to stay. I let my family's judgment cloud my own, and I let fear dictate my actions. You deserved better than that. You once told me music was your lifeline, your sanctuary. Watching you at the park reminded me of the person I had the privilege of knowing, the person who plays not for the applause, but because it's who she is. I want you to know I've made changes. I've officially ended my engagement to Olivia. It wasn't easy, and yes, my mother fought it every step of the way, but it's done. For the first time, I chose for myself. And if I can choose, I choose to value you for who you are, not for your past, not for your name, but for the strength and brilliance you carry in every note you play. I know this next chapter of your life will be transformative. Paris is everything you've dreamed of, and I'll be cheering for you every step of the way, even from a distance. But if you ever find yourself ready to return to Chicago, ready to see what we could be without the weight of expectation, I'll be waiting. Yours, Edward. Joyce read the letter twice, her heart simultaneously heavy and full. She traced the last few words with her finger, the sincerity of his handwriting anchoring her in the moment. "You okay?" Brenda's voice broke through her thoughts. Joyce nodded slowly, folding the letter and placing it back into the envelope. "He really broke it off with Olivia." Brenda nodded. "He stood up to Victoria too. Told her she couldn't dictate his life anymore. It wasn't pretty, but he didn't back down." Joyce smiled faintly, though tears welled in her eyes. "That sounds like him." "So," Brenda said gently, "what are you going to do?" Joyce looked down at her ticket, then back at the bustling terminal. "I'm going to Paris," she said firmly, though her voice trembled. "I need to do this, for me." Brenda nodded in approval, her smile kind. "Then go, but don't lose that letter." Joyce chuckled softly, slipping the envelope into her bag. "I won't." When the announcer read the announcement, Joyce boarded with purpose, her carry-on rolling quietly behind her. She found her seat by the window, the city stretching out before her like a map of memories. As the plane began to take off, she pressed her hand against the glass, watching Chicago fade into the distance. The future felt daunting, but exciting, the possibilities endless. She opened her bag and pulled out the letter again, reading Edward's final words once more. "If you ever feel ready to return to Chicago, I'll be waiting." For the first time in years, Joyce allowed herself to hope. Not just for her career, but for a life where she wasn't defined by her past. And as the plane carried her toward Paris, she whispered softly to no one in particular, "Maybe one day." Paris shimmered beneath the soft glow of dusk as Joyce stepped onto the stage of a small but prestigious concert hall. The murmurs of the audience faded into silence as she sat at the grand piano, the lights above catching the faint shimmer of her evening gown. She took a deep breath, placing her hands on the keys. The melody began gently, building with each passing moment, her fingers weaving together years of longing, struggle, and triumph. The audience was rapt, drawn into the world she created with every note. 2 years had passed since she first arrived in Paris. The conservatory had pushed her in ways she hadn't imagined, challenging her to grow as a musician and a person. Through late nights of practice and moments of self-doubt, she had persevered. She wasn't just Joyce Wagner anymore. She was Joyce, an artist. As she played the final chord, the applause erupted, her heart swelling with pride and relief. She rose, bowing gracefully, her smile genuine but tempered with a quiet ache she carried everywhere. Back in her small Paris apartment, Joyce placed her sheet music on the desk by the window. The room was cozy, filled with the warmth of her carefully collected mementos. A photo of her conservatory classmates, a small Eiffel Tower figurine, and a ticket stub from her first Parisian recital. But her gaze lingered on one object in particular, a neatly folded letter tucked inside her journal. Edward's words, written 2 years earlier, remained as vivid as the day she'd read them. She traced the edges of the paper absent-mindedly, her thoughts drifting back to Chicago. She hadn't contacted him. Not once. She had convinced herself that she needed to focus on her music, to grow into the person she wanted to be before facing him again. But the quiet yearning had never left. The city buzzed with the excitement of the holiday season. Lights adorned every corner, and the scent of roasted chestnuts lingered in the air. Joyce wandered through the streets, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck as she admired the festive displays. Her phone buzzed, and she pulled it from her pocket. It was a message from Brenda. Coming back to Chicago for Christmas. Joyce halted abruptly, her breath evident in the chilly atmosphere. She hadn't told anyone, not even Brenda, about the flight she had already booked. "Maybe," she replied, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed. Her decision to return had come in a quiet moment of reflection weeks earlier. Despite her success, there was something unfinished, something she couldn't leave behind. The plane hummed softly as it soared over the Atlantic, the cabin dimly lit as passengers dozed or watched in-flight movies. Joyce stared out the window, her fingers lightly tapping the armrest. The thought of seeing Edward again filled her with equal parts anticipation and dread. Would he still be waiting, as his letter had promised? Or had time and distance changed everything? She pulled out the letter again, unfolding it carefully. His words had carried her through the toughest moments at the conservatory, a quiet reminder of someone who had believed in her when she struggled to believe in herself. "I'll be waiting," she whispered, her voice barely audible. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, Joyce pressed her forehead against the cool glass, the city lights sprawling out beneath her. Her heart raced as she recognized familiar landmarks, each one pulling her closer to the life she had left behind. The wheels touched down with a soft jolt, and Joyce let out a shaky breath. This was it. She stepped off the plane and into the terminal, her carry-on rolling quietly behind her. The bustle of O'Hare enveloped her, but she barely noticed as her thoughts raced. She wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time, she felt ready to find out. The cold Chicago air welcomed her as she walked toward the exit. Joyce paused, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. Home, she thought, though the word felt both familiar and foreign. The city stretched before her, alive with memories and possibilities. And somewhere out there, Edward was waiting. Or so she hoped. The soft clink of glasses and low hum of conversation filled the intimate warmth of the restaurant. Flickering candles on each table cast golden glows, their light reflecting off polished silverware. A garland of holly and crimson ribbon adorned the walls, and snowflakes clung to the windows, hinting at the frigid winter outside. Edward sat alone at a corner table, absently swirling the wine in his glass. A plate of untouched pasta sat before him, its steam long gone. His gaze drifted to the softly glowing Christmas tree in the corner, but the sight did little to lift the melancholy weighing him down. It was Brenda's idea to book the table for him. She had insisted he get out of his penthouse, try something new for the holidays, and take a moment to relax. But all it had done was remind him of how empty the past 2 years had felt. He exhaled deeply, his thoughts inevitably pulling him back to Joyce. Despite the time and distance, she remained a constant presence in his mind. Her sharp wit, her quiet strength, the way she made him question everything about his life. A sudden melody rippled through the restaurant, soft and familiar, the kind of tune that stirred memories and emotions, long buried. Edward's head snapped up, his breath catching. The piano. The notes flowed seamlessly, delicate yet powerful, filling the room with an almost sacred air. Edward's heart pounded as he turned toward the small stage, set near the center of the room. There she was. Joyce sat at the piano, her head slightly bowed, her fingers dancing effortlessly over the keys. Her black dress shimmered faintly in the candlelight, and the intensity of her focus made her seem untouchable. The melody reached a crescendo, and Edward felt his chest tighten. This wasn't just a performance, it was a story. Her story. And every note seemed to speak to him, of pain, growth, longing, and hope. As the final chord echoed through the room, silence followed, thick with reverence. Then, a warm and enthusiastic applause erupted, shattering the spell. Joyce lifted her head, offering a small but genuine smile to the audience. Her gaze swept across the room, lingering as it met Edward's. For a brief moment, time appeared to stop. He stood slowly, his chair scraping softly against the floor. The look in her eyes was enough to send a surge of emotion crashing over him, relief, joy, and a flicker of fear that he might be dreaming. Joyce rose from the piano bench, her steps deliberate as she made her way toward him. The room seemed to fade around them, the buzz of conversation reduced to a distant hum. When she stopped in front of him, neither spoke at first. "You came back," Edward said finally, his voice low but filled with wonder. "I did," Joyce replied, her tone steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "And I contacted Brenda. I knew you'd be here." Edward's lips parted slightly in surprise. "You arranged this?" She nodded, glancing briefly at the piano. "I wanted to make sure I had something worth saying before I saw you again." His gaze softened, searching her face. "And do you?" Joyce hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I've spent the past 2 years wondering if we made a mistake, if leaving was the right choice. I thought I needed to run from everything, from Chicago, from my past, from you. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't stop thinking about us." Edward's brow furrowed, his hand flexing at his side. "Joyce, She shook her head gently, cutting him off. "I need to say this. You were right to push me toward Paris. It gave me everything I needed to grow, to find myself again. But..." She paused, her voice softening. "Even when I was on stage, living my dream, something was missing. And I think I left it here, with you." Edward struggled to find his voice, as the weight of her words hovered between them. Finally, he stepped closer, his expression vulnerable in a way Joyce had never seen before. "I never stopped waiting," he admitted. "Not for a second. I've replayed every moment with you in my head, wondering if I could have done things differently. And if you're here now, telling me there's still a chance, then I'm not letting you go again." For the first time in years, she felt the walls surrounding her heart crumble as her breath caught. "I'm here," she said simply. Edward reached out, taking her hands in his. "Then let's start again. No deals, no doubts. Just us." The corners of her lips curved into a smile, her fingers tightening around his. "I'd like that." The restaurant's warm glow seemed to embrace them as the world slowly came back into focus. Joyce felt the quiet buzz of excitement building in her chest, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to believe in for far too long. This was their Christmas. A beginning, not an ending. The soft glow of candlelight danced across the polished surfaces of the small restaurant. Snowflakes tapped gently against the frosted windows, their delicate patterns illuminated by the warm light within. Edward and Joyce sat across from each other at a corner table, the space between them filled with the quiet weight of their reunion. A single candle flickered on the table, its flame steady, mirroring the unspoken emotions lingering between them. Outside, the city hummed softly, muffled by the thick blanket of snow covering the streets. Edward leaned forward, his hands resting on the edge of the table. "You don't know how many times I've thought about this moment," he admitted, his voice low and steady. "How many ways I imagined what I'd say if you came back." Joyce met his gaze, her expression open yet cautious. "And what did you imagine?" He smiled faintly, a hint of self-deprecation in his expression. "Mostly apologies, for doubting you, for not trusting you when I should have. I let my family's opinions and my own fear get in the way of what mattered." He paused, his voice thick with regret. "You..." Her fingers traced the edge of her glass, the flickering candlelight catching the faint shimmer of her bracelet. "I thought about you too," she said softly, her voice laced with vulnerability. "More than I wanted to admit. Even in Paris, on the stage, living the life I'd dreamed of, I couldn't stop wondering what it would have been like if I had stayed." Edward's chest tightened, her words cutting through the guarded hope he had carried for so long. "Why didn't you?" he asked gently. Joyce's lips pressed into a thin line as she considered her answer. "Because I wasn't ready," she said finally. "I needed to know who I was, without the weight of my past, or the fear of being defined by it. I needed to establish my independence and demonstrate to myself that I was more than just his daughter." Edward nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And now?" She hesitated, her fingers stilling on the glass. "Now, I know that running didn't make those fears go away, but facing them, accepting them, that's what made me stronger." Her gaze lifted, meeting his with quiet determination. "And part of that means being honest about what I want, about who I want." The air between them felt charged, a fragile thread pulling tighter with every word. Edward's voice softened. "And who is that?" "You," she said simply, her voice unwavering. A slow, relieved smile spread across his face, and for the first time in years, the weight on his chest seemed to lift. He whispered, "I never stopped waiting for you, Joyce. I never could." Her smile mirrored his, tentative but genuine, as though testing the strength of this new beginning. "Then maybe it's time we stop waiting." After dinner, they stepped outside, the icy air biting at their cheeks. Snow fell gently around them, blanketing the streets in pristine white. The world felt quieter, softer, as if holding its breath for them. Edward offered his hand, and Joyce slipped hers into his without hesitation. His warmth enveloped her fingers, anchoring her to the present moment. They walked together along the snow-covered sidewalks, their steps in sync, their laughter mingling with the faint sound of carolers in the distance. As they passed a small church, its bells began to chime, filling the air with a melodic resonance that seemed almost magical. Joyce glanced up, the sound stirring something deep within her. This Feels surreal, she admitted, her breath visible in the cold. Edward stopped, turning to face her. It's real, he said, his tone firm yet tender. You're here, I'm here, and we're going to figure this out, together. She nodded, the sincerity in his voice melting away the last of her doubts. Together, she echoed, a small but radiant smile breaking across her face. They strolled on, the city encircling them like a familiar companion. The snow swirled lazily in the air, catching in their hair and dusting their coats. Edward tightened his grip on her hand, and Joyce squeezed back, their silent promise stronger than words. As they reached the bridge overlooking the river, the lights of Chicago reflected in the water below, creating a scene so beautiful it felt almost otherworldly. They paused, taking in the view, the quiet moment a testament to how far they had come. This feels like the start of something, Joyce said softly, her voice tinged with wonder. Edward glanced at her, his eyes warm and steady. It is. The bells chimed once more, their melody carrying across the city as the clock struck midnight. Christmas Eve had arrived, and with it, the promise of a new beginning. Hand in hand, they walked back into the city, their laughter and footsteps leaving a trail in the snow. For the first time in years, the future felt bright, not because of what they had left behind, but because of what lay ahead. Together, if this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.